So welcome everybody to our August green drinks. Before we get going, I'd also like to welcome BEAT's new Education and Outreach Coordinator, Sarit Mizrachi. Sarit just started with BEAT a couple weeks ago. She's been producing our free weekly e-newsletter, the BEAT News, with news from around the region, calendar of events, jobs board, and public notices. She's also been immersing herself in all of the work that BEAT does, helping with invasive hardy kiwi removal at Burbank Park, getting some of the water quality samples from storm drain pipes going into the Housatonic River, protesting at the peaking power plant to get Pittsfield Generating to actually meet with us to try to get them to transition to clean energy. And also we've taken field trips to see where the Tell Electric Dam was removed on the west branch of the Housatonic River, and to Churchill Brook, where we're watching a fish count to see what effects removing 2 culverts and replacing them with bridges is having on the size of fish distributed throughout that brook. So this is Sarit's first green drinks. So I'm going to be running the logistics and then turning it over for her to introduce tonight's presenter. Boy, and I'm not doing a good job. I've got trouble with, there we go. So I'm sure everybody already knows, but you can unmute and mute yourself on the lower, well, at least for me, the lower left side of the screen. You can check and see who all the participants are, and you can leave questions in the chat. For the most part, if you hold your questions till the end of the presentation, I think we'll be able to just have people unmute and actually ask questions at the end. Don't forget, we can see you. Please don't take us to the bathroom with you. Just a brief bit about BEAT. You can check us out on our website, thebeatnews.org. We have a great weekly newsletter with a community calendar that you can also find on our website, a jobs board for environmental jobs. We also update the environmental monitor with large projects that are happening in the Berkshires and the Pioneer Valley. It's a little weird now because the state has just changed their website to make it much more difficult to find all the information on these projects. And we have a public notices section for things like the Conservation Commission hearings that are happening around town. So tonight, we're going to have a fantastic presentation on shorebird conservation. Our next meeting will be September 21st at 6 p.m. And because of COVID, we aren't sure if we're going to be in person or online. So stay tuned. And that'll make a difference for what our speaker will be next time as well. So all this is made possible through your generosity. Please feel free to donate. We have a donate button right on our website. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarit to introduce our tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Jane. So to introduce Lisa, Lisa Schibley joined the Shorebird Recovery Program at Manomet in 2008, and she is currently the North American Coordinator for the International Shorebird Survey, or ISS. And she's recruiting and engaging ISS volunteers and finding creative ways to tell shorebird stories using the ISS data. Lisa has a master's in physics from the University of Arizona, and her background is in numerical analysis. As an enthusiastic birder living in Arizona, she coordinated the Tucson Christmas bird count and led field trips for the Tucson Audubon Society. She currently leads trips for the South Shore Bird Club, excuse me. So thank you so much, Lisa, for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Sarit and BEAT, for inviting me to Zoom with y'all. Noah talks all the time about the great conservation stuff that BEAT does for the greenest part of our state. And I'm so happy to chat with you a little bit about what I do with ISS. All right, let me share my screen. All right, can everybody see that? All right.
Looks good.
All right. So, hey, everyone. I'm Lisa Schibley. And as Sarit mentioned, I am the North American Coordinator for the International Shorebird Survey, also known as ISS. I wanted to start with a little bit about Manomet, because I know not everybody is familiar with our mission and vision. Our primary campus is located in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and that's where I am. But we have projects and scientists located across the Western Hemisphere, from the North Slope of Alaska to the southern tip of Argentina and many, many places in between. The Shorebird program at Manomet, there's a Shorebird program, there's a Landbird program, fisheries program, forestry program, lots of different pieces. But the Shorebird program at Manomet is basically organized into three main categories. We have projects in shorebird science, site conservation, and habitat management. And ISS, the International Shorebird Survey, contributes data to all of these endeavors across all of these categories. So the International Shorebird Survey is a shorebird monitoring project that relies on volunteers to count shorebirds during migration across the Western Hemisphere. We're not in the Eastern Hemisphere. We're not in Europe, Africa, Asia. We're only in North and South America. And so ISS brought together two powerful ideas. First, to understand where conservation is needed and to know if initiatives have been effective, shorebird scientists need to understand species populations and trends. And secondly, that a dedicated and enthusiastic group of shorebirders across the Western Hemisphere could supply the shorebird scientists with the data that they need to make a difference. Just going to talk a little history. So Brian Harrington started ISS in 1974. So we're approaching the 50th year anniversary. By 1980, he had recruited over 100 shorebird enthusiasts across the hemisphere who were sending in thousands of surveys by hand each year. And of course, back then, there were no computers or internet. So they would take these sheets, you can see one of them on the left side of the screen, and through the migration season, they would go to their site and they would record all of their numbers. And at the end of the season, they would send their data sheet back into Brian, and he would enter them into a database, and then the numbers could be tabulated and analyzed. And in 2006, Brian transitioned the data intake process to eBird. And in 2019, we hit 100,000 surveys submitted. So that's a little bit of our basic history. And so why did ISS work? So when Brian Harrington joined Manomet, he wanted to answer these important questions about shorebird migration and population biology. And the shorebirds he was thinking about were those that nest in the high Arctic tundra in Canada and Alaska, and they pass through North America, following the sun, to winter in South and Central America. And the puzzle was that the places where these shorebirds spent most of their time in the North and the South were often remote and logistically complex for shorebird scientists to access. So how could scientists, with limited funding, of course, best document population sizes and trends for these long distant migrants? Well, Brian's idea was to enlist volunteers around the hemisphere, the volunteers who already loved the birds, loved the shorebirds, loved the places that these shorebirds spent time on, and asked these shorebirds to visit these spots regularly and count their birds and send them the results. And so this network of volunteers evolved into Manomet's International Shorebird Survey. And it's one of the longest running citizen science projects in the world. So here's a little snapshot of ISS today. These are all of the ISS, both historic and current, across the hemisphere and in New England. And in 2020, ISS had 455 contributors, sending in about 5,000 surveys from 4,802 sites in 21 countries. across the hemisphere. And so I just want to talk about a couple of different ways that ISS data is used. For example, in 2019, the 3 billion bird study came out. And by combining information about trends with original estimations of populations, the study estimated that from over the last 50 years in North America, 3 billion birds have disappeared. And the primary authors were Cornell, American Bird Conservancy, and wildlife agencies of US and Canada. And for most of the species, I mean, they looked across hundreds of species. And for most of the species, the data came from breeding bird surveys and the Christmas bird counts. But for 20 species of shorebirds, those couldn't supply the data that the scientists needed, so they turned to ISS. And you've probably heard of the study because the study results, the campaign really captured the public's attention in a way that few scientific studies have. Cornell and other contributors created a set of stories that were picked up by the media to an astonishing extent, something that really hasn't been done that much before. And my favorite part of the 3 billion birds project, other than the fact that it actually used ISS data, is that they really emphasized the hope of the story, that they talked about how raptors and waterfowl were two families that have actually increased over this 50-year period. And that's because those families have had really targeted and action conservation plans in place for decades. And so it's a story of hope, because if we can get that same energy into other families like shorebirds and grassland birds, we can see the same results. And I also love that the campaign gave people 7 simple actions that they could do. And contributing to citizen science was one of them, and they used ISS as an example of how people can make a difference. So this campaign is something that we at ISS talk about a lot, because it's just an example of how everything can work together. And then another, Paul Smith is a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and one of the lead authors of the 3 billion birds survey. He's been using ISS for his research for about 10 years. And this map is another example of how he looks at ISS data. And this, you can see, has a direct connection to England, so, New England. So he's kind of focused on the Northeast region of the continent. And so he's representing ISS data as these circles where he's looking at the decrease of shorebirds. And this one in particular is the white rump sandpiper. You can see the cute little picture of them down in the corner. And so blue means less negative trends, red means more negative trends. And then the size of the dot represents the strength of the data. That's how he brings his model together, is by figuring out how best to estimate the strength of the data based on the number of data points. And it's interesting. These results are actually kind of in process. They're going to be presented in a full paper that's currently in the publication pipeline. But I'm looking forward to his discussion of how the shorebirds seem to be doing slightly better in New England than in the maritime Canadian provinces. You can see there's more blue in New England than red, and unfortunately more red up in Canada. So that's something that I'm looking forward to, that paper that'll be coming out sometime soon, I think. In addition to looking at some of these broad hemispheric trends, ISS is used in some more local projects. For example, ISS is used in identifying important stopover sites. So this is a map of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network sites. And so ISS data is used in the identification of these sites. So WISRN is a science-based, partnership-driven conservation initiative for protecting critical sites of shorebirds throughout the Americas. And the first Western site was designated in 1985, and that was Delaware Bay, which we all know how important it is for shorebirds. And the network today includes 111 sites in 18 countries, and it covers 39 million acres of shorebird habitat. And to become part of the network, you have to agree to take into account shorebirds in your management plan. So it's not like anywhere in the whole, anywhere can be like an IBA. You guys have heard of IBAs. To be in Western, you have to agree to take shorebirds into account in your management plans. And then there are 2 Western sites in New England, and the first one is Great Marsh, which is which includes Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. And the second one is Monomoy. So that's at the elbow of Cape Cod. And so both of those were established with Brian's ISS data. And then ISS provides local data too. So these are actually some examples from New England. So as ISS became established as an important protocol for monitoring shorebird populations, partners began to rely on it to supply data necessary for conducting management, conservation, and research at local scales. So National Wildlife Refuges have included ISS in their management documents. Like, for example, the middle one is the Monomoy Comprehensive Conservation Plan. And state and federal biologists also use the data to quantify and understand local issues. So I have a couple of examples. Lindsay Tudor, who's the was the shorebird biologist for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. She was, for 30 years, she had that job, and she just recently retired. But she's responsible for more than 10,000 ISS counts because she has this incredible army of volunteers all through the Maine coast. And 10,000 counts is amazing. So she told us that the data collected by Maine volunteers plays an important part in identification and conservation of shorebird areas along Maine's coast. And then we have Kate O'Brien, who's a wildlife biologist at Rachel Carlson National Wildlife Refuge, told us that ISS has been very helpful when documenting important shorebird roosts and foraging areas, allowing them to improve conservation of these important areas and forming the basis for future studies. So we've been corresponding with all of these volunteers and volunteer coordinators trying to understand what makes ISS work for them. So whenever we hear something positive like that, we write it down and make notes and say, okay, we're using that. We're trying to make sure that people know how valuable ISS is. And so one of the last goals of ISS is to build a shorebird constituency. So in addition to estimating the population sizes and finding the trends of migrating shorebirds by looking at this data over 50 years, identifying the important stopover sites, for Western and contributing to local research. It's so important as part of ISS to build this constituency, to build a group of people who are willing to take that next step. And from the very beginning, Brian knew that shorebirds often inspire this particular passion, and that it wouldn't take much encouragement for shorebird enthusiasts to translate that passion into actions, that help shorebirds. And some of the original individuals that he recruited have submitted hundreds and even thousands of counts. And the list on the slide includes some of the most prolific ISS contributors in New England and the sites that they have covered. And there are a lot of familiar names on that slide. He definitely started this, almost 50 years ago with a very strong base of shorebird enthusiasts. And so I actually am skipping over a number of other slides that I have. Like, for example, I have some ISS logistics slides, how to, other things that we do. And But if any of them are relevant to any of the questions that anybody has, I'm certainly happy to skip back to them. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then just have, and just have my thank you slide up. And I have to do one last thing. All right, so we are deeply grateful to all of the volunteers counting shorebirds for the ISS. They make a tremendous effort to get out to their sites on a repetitive basis and submit their data through eBird. We hope that they know that the importance of their work and the value of their surveys for conservation initiatives. And citizen science remains one of the greatest methods for widespread monitoring efforts. And so anyone interested in making a difference the next time they feel like heading out to a walk to their favorite shorebird spot or even birding spot, please consider doing so on behalf of ISS or another citizen science project. What you consider a hobby could contribute to the next big shorebird science discovery. Thank you very much.
Neat, neat. Thank you so much, Lisa. This is really cool. So I'd like to open it up for questions. And I think that we have a small enough group that we can just have you unmute to ask your questions.
So you said that in Canada, there were significant decreases in shorebirds, but it doesn't make sense to me because
the decrease, I'll go back to that slide. The decreases were everywhere, but for some reason, and like I said, it's something that they're still working on the publication of. For some reason, there are greater decreases in Canada than in New England. And I don't actually have a theory on why that is. This is something that's fairly new that I've just heard. I've heard about the decreases across the hemisphere, and that's true whether you're on the East Coast or the West Coast or in Argentina. You know, the numbers are going down, but this is the first bit of research that I've seen that are trying to understand differences between that decrease.
Well, I would imagine nesting sites haven't been degraded and less pollution up there than the more southern Atlantic.
They do, yeah. They do find that the nesting shorebirds do migrate in certain populations. So you have migrating fall shorebirds that are coming from the entire Arctic that pass through northeastern part of the continent. So from Alaska to mid-Canada to eastern Canada, all of those Arctic nesting shorebirds, they all travel eastward and then hit our coastline, and then they drop down south to South America or Central America. But they do find that the ones from Alaska might spend more time in Canada or vice versa. I forget which it is right now, but they do have a path, and they're starting to put these GPS locators on the transmitters on the birds and track them using the MODIS network. So they're really coming up with exactly what population goes there, where, and that will definitely help figure out what specific threats we need to address where. So all this data is all going into a lot of focused work.
There's one dynamic, and I have no idea if it relates, but with climate change, it's warming. The greatest change in average temperature is higher the further north you go. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that could be impacting Canada more.
I think that's a really good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, it's warming faster up there.
It is. And a lot of our longest distant migrants, like the red knot and the semi-palmated sandpiper, they're the ones that do nest in the farthest north of the Arctic. So that definitely is something that they're looking at. And I should say that I'm not a shorebird scientist. So I don't have a degree in biology or ecology. I've always just played the numbers and really, was thrilled to find this little niche that I've been able to help with. But, there are so many shorebird scientists at Manomet that could speak to these kind of questions better than I can. So I can tell you what I've heard them say, but I haven't actually done the research.
Lisa, can you clarify one thing for me? These decreases are just for migrating white rumped sandpipers, not breeding, correct?
There are a couple of breeding shorebirds that are actually doing better. Like, for example, the American oyster catcher population is actually increasing. So when you're looking at that 3 billion bird decrease, that's across the entire spectrum of birds, shorebirds but when you look at some individual species, they are increasing. And that's what gives us hope, that there are examples and we can figure out what's going right and just get them going right for a broader example of the population. But for the most part, the long distance migrants uniformly are decreasing.
I have a question kind of in the climate crisis area. And I respect what you said, that this isn't necessarily your expertise, but I'm really curious how, trends of air movement are shifting, and how, if there's been any like, for example, I think the Gulf Stream or the, like the currents are actually starting to, it's noticeably shifting how they're flowing. And I'm wondering if anybody has had any observations about how that might impact migration.
The interesting thing is that, and I actually have heard someone talk about this recently. So I think,
good.
So there's two pieces of information that are very interesting. One is, if a shorebird is fat enough, how they double their weight or even more before migration, if they have the fuel, they can fly through a hurricane. They can, and they understand that there's going to be shifts of wind, that sometimes the wind is going to be in their direction and sometimes it's not. But as long as they have as long as they have that fat, they can make that migration even if the winds are against them. Not if it shifts completely and they're going to be blowing completely in the wrong direction absolutely all the time, then probably not. But in general, because the winds are going to vary and they might be a little bit less favorable than they were otherwise, most of the time, if the shorebirds are fat enough, they can get through it. The problem is not necessarily the shift in winds, but the fact that they're not getting the fat that they need. And that has more to do with the ecosystem rather than the winds. So I would say that what I've heard is that the ecosystem will be a stronger factor in migration failure than the winds. Again, I haven't done any of the research, but that seems to be what I understand.
Interesting, thank you.
I have two questions, if I might. One, why haven't you linked up with the 1 billion out of 1.5 billion decrease in seabirds? And they are very sensitive to climate change since they depend upon small fish and plankton and so forth. Shorebirds have a complete different diet. And so there's a 2/3 decrease in seabirds. And my second question is, could you point me to a couple of articles or links about the decrease in shorebirds?
So the 3 billion bird study is at 3billionbirds.org.
Right.
I don't think I have a link on one of my slides for that one.
Yeah, you did. I got it off of that.
I'm trying to, did I have, going back to 3 billion. Yeah, so that's a link that talks about the 3 billion birds project. And so that is the biggest synthesis of shorebird dropping data that's out there until Paul Smith's next paper comes out, and then that'll be the next one. So if there's also the stateofthebirds.org. So stateofthebirds.org is an annual report produced by the wildlife agencies of both Canada and the United States. And they put out, every year they put out a report that talks about what the most recent data says. And Paul Smith is an author on those too. And that again talks about all birds, but they break it down into shorebirds too. So that might be a helpful one.
And the link with seabirds?
It's stateofthebirds.org. I can put it in the chat. Can I? Maybe
Yep.
I can't. Not while my screen is shared. I don't think I can.
Noah, can you put that in the chat?
I just put it in the chat, and the
Thank
3
you.
billion birds too.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you
And
very much.
Lisa,
And
when
then
Paul,
your answer about the, I'm sorry, but there was a second question about seabirds. So seabirds are harder for citizen science is the census. Most of the census that are done for seabirds are done by NOAA. They have the ships that go across the Atlantic Ocean or up and down the Atlantic Ocean and have observers, usually biologists on them. That's where we get most of our numbers of seabirds. Lots of people are doing research with gulls. And so there's the Appledore Gull Project. Because Manomet has always done shorebirds, that's why we focus on shorebirds, but there are a lot of other really good projects for seabirds as well. But Manomet hasn't ever had seabirds as one of its focuses, I must say. We do a lot with landbirds, a lot with shorebirds, less with seabirds.
Lisa, would you be willing to send me a link to Paul Smith's article when it does come out, and we can
Absolutely.
make sure that word gets out?
I think it's going to be mid next year. They're just finishing up the writing. Of course, they have the whole review process to go through.
Neat. Any other questions for Lisa?
So,
Hi, my name is Pauline. Is that okay if I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
So thank you for speaking with us today. It's been really informative and very interesting.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering how to become a person, like if they're just submitting on eBird, how can it also go to your organization? Like, do you just submit on eBird and then, I mean, how do they submit it now? I don't understand the difference.
Let me bring up that slide. So this is your eBird app. And when you submit an ISS survey on your eBird app, we ask our volunteers to scroll down observation type and select the International Shorebird Survey. So it goes directly to the eBird database, but it's tagged with ISS. That means that when we download the data, we get everything that's been tagged with ISS. And then it goes into our database, and then we have a mapping tool. So everybody gets to see their ISS data. And you get to explore it and look at it. We have some different tools than the eBird app has. But when it's tagged with ISS, it comes into our database, which is a separate database from eBirds. We think of eBird as a nice tool to use as a intake, but when it comes to our data, that's where our scientists do their work on it.
Okay, so I have one other quick question. So I just looked on eBird. I don't see where you put the observation type. I guess I'm just interested in this. I'm not doing it, but I'm just like, where do you put the observation type? I just looked at eBird. I do eBird all the time. So.
Yeah, when you know where you select traveling, stationary.
Oh, there. That's when you do it. Oh, okay.
Scroll down, and ISS is usually one of the ones on the
bottom. Oh, that's how you do it. Okay. Yeah. So stationary, traveling, and then you do it. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So if you're interested in submitting, let me see if I have, yeah, I have these. If you're interested in submitting ISS, we do have a website that we have some protocols under. We ask anybody who submits to take a look at them, but the basic one is repeatability. So we ask someone to visit their site at least 3 times during a migration season. So 3 times in the spring or 3 times in the fall. More is better, but the one of the things that and then consistency. So we ask people to cover their site in the same way, at the same tide, in about the same time, and always covering the same area. And because we ask people to do that, and we think they understand how important that is, that makes the data consistent, and that means that it makes the models work in the way that just selecting some random eBird data might not.
Fascinating. Any other questions for Lisa?
And I can put this too. How to cover
Thank you very much. That was very informative. Thank you.
Okay. So I have all these slides. I didn't know. we actually don't have, I'm gonna go back. Let's go back to this one. I have so many slides. Okay. All right, so we don't have IS sites in the Berkshires. I know that there's not a lot of shorebird sites in the Berkshires. There are shorebirds, but we do have ISS sites in the Connecticut River Valley. So there's definitely some ISS in Western Massachusetts, but we're all, I never want to say, oh, I'm not going to tell you all about how to be an ISS contributor, because anybody can be an ISS contributor, but it does take some shorebirds.
Seagulls in the parking lot don't count, do they?
Shorebirds, yeah, shorebirds are the sandpipers, the plovers, the oyster catchers, the dunlin, all those guys that you see walking along the shore and picking at stuff in sand.
Sounds to me
Instead of
like
picking
this is
French fries.
We actually
challenge.
have a lot of shorebirds in Sheffield and Tyringham. We do have quite a few, so not in the hundreds, but we have a lot of variety there.
Nice. I'd love to get some ISS counts from there.
Okay, I'll make sure I do that.
Pauline, are you a member of the Hoffman Bird Club?
Of course.
Okay, I'm just thinking that a band of Hoffman Bird Clubbers could become the ISS watchers for the Berkshires.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, I was just among the first people to see a roseate spoonbill in Corbin's Neck recently, so that was very exciting. That's not, yeah, that's exciting.
Green.
That's great. Any other questions?
Yeah, Lisa, what's one of the big things that buoys you up in these times of climate crisis?
That the scientists I know are working so hard, and they're so smart, and they're figuring things out. Like, I can't even believe some of the stuff that they figure out. And there's scientists that are working on fixing the original problem, and then there's scientists that are working on mitigation. Okay, if we can change the way the ocean flows in certain, like my boss actually is working with the Army Corps of Engineers right now to figure out how to change the process of dredging to make coasts more resilient to climate change. That is what gives me hope, is that these people they're smart and they're working hard. They really are.
Thank you.
I think my other answer to that question is always, what choice do we have? I mean, we've got to try our hardest, because otherwise
Every year, more people seem to care. More people are shouting about it every year, it seems. Eventually.
Hopefully in time to prevent the worst. Neat. Well, thank you so very much. I learned a ton. This is really great. And I'm inspired to get out and actually go where I know there'll be some shorebirds and take a look. Then I just have to be able to identify them.
Bring your
Yeah, those
binoculars.
shorebirds are a little tricky. I still do dow at your spa sometimes, you know. That's fine.
Neat. Well, thank you very much. Oh, I had one other question for you. Oh, as scientists figure out why New England seems to be doing better than the Maritimes, will you come back and let us know that as well?
Sure, absolutely. It'll probably also be in the ISS newsletter. So anytime anybody does an ISS count, they will automatically get the ISS newsletter. And you shouldn't opt out, of course, like that. But we try to keep all of our volunteers appraised of how their data is being used.
Neat. Sounds fascinating. Thank you very, very much. And thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you all enjoyed as much as I did.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Great.
Have a great evening.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet y'all.